So we are now going to look at week 10 and 11, and I'm going to give you an overview of the general themes for those 2 weeks. We started out by looking at investment securities and then moved onward to digital assets. The idea is that, or the idea has always been, that the investment of a shareholder, but also debt holder, is something that they can keep for however long they wish, but they can also transfer. So there is a body of law that has developed facilitating the transfer of investments. And the idea is that that helps the issuer, because if somebody lends money to a company through a debenture, a bond, or if somebody becomes a shareholder, they know they don't have to remain a shareholder for the foreseeable future. They're able to liquidate that asset and sell it. But the company, notwithstanding this, can keep the money permanently. So it gives the company access to permanent funds while allowing the investor to change its investment profile, his or her investment profile, and sell the asset. So what are investment securities? They're transferable financial asset. They include equities, shares, but also debt securities. And that's what I just explained. There's a primary market when they are initially issued, and then there are subsequent transfers. Property rights then facilitate the transfer, and transfers occur in 3 steps. There's first the trading phase, then there's a clearing phase, and then there is a settlement phase. And the idea is to cause these 2 phases to be as effective as possible, meaning that buyers and sellers in an ideal world are not exposed to any risk of any insolvency risk arising from the respective other party. So what we're going to look at is settlement, the last part. And what we don't want is that the buyer, so we are guarding against the buyers after the trade and after clearing exposure to the seller for trades that are in the money trades where the buyer has paid. And the settlement then is the delivery of property rights in purchase assets against payment. Before we look at the current situation, it's worth remembering what the background is. So in England, securities are registered securities. The idea is that the investor's name is registered with the issuer, and they're transferred by way of novation. Another very different way is to use negotiable instruments, where the law assumes that the instruments are paper documents which embody the claim against the issuer, and you transfer by delivery of the document. And paper-based settlement was effectively a sorting process where certificates were transferred from sellers to buyers. And then we spoke about that, of course, the more transactions there are, the more difficult it becomes to sort paper. And with the arrival of computers, we moved from paper-based transfers to account-based transfers using information technology. And here are the 2 different ways in which this sort of was analyzed, and in England we ended up with immobilization, or rather in Germany we ended up with immobilization through depositaries, and in England there's dematerialization through computer instructions. And we spoke about how that is differently analyzed. in both systems, the problem, there has been a problem with moving from paper to electronic settlement. The German system overcame this by assuming or adopting a concept of constructive possession. So the idea was a credit on a computer account is like changing possession through the underlying document. In England, that wasn't necessary because securities were always registered. So whereas before, the company learned about a new shareholder by being presented with a paper document, now they receive computer instructions. And here are some examples of why this caused problems. Now, then moving on to what happens now is we've got new assets that are purely digital. So there is no underlying asset, and those would be crypto assets, for example, bitcoins and other cryptocurrencies, where what you have is not a claim against someone. You just have a right to dispose of an entry on this register. And there, of course, legal questions arise, but we are gradually moving towards characterizing these as property and trying to apply our property law to them. The technological innovation was initially one of ledgers being distributed, meaning there wasn't a central register, but every participant had their own register and it was updated through a consensus mechanism. And in addition, entries were connected to each other in what is called a blockchain, and that makes them very difficult to be manipulated. So there is this technological specialty. From the legal perspective, of course, some questions arise out of that. But the bigger legal challenge for crypto assets is the fact that they don't have any claim which backs them up. But nevertheless, property law seems to apply to them. So what we have first looked at are the foundations in property law, and the idea that you can have a financial assets, which is an intangible asset, and transfer it either through a paper document or through a register or through then a really more advanced version of a register through a distributed ledger, and where entries can also be blockchained. So that was sort of the foundational analysis. Now, let's look then at the current infrastructure. We started out by saying that shareholders are registered, and that's true, but shareholders are not ultimate investors. So the problem in this area arises because we used to have issuers and the investors were registered, their names were registered on the issuer register. Now we've got something called intermediation. So there's custodians between issuers and investors. And the problem that has arisen there is that these are contractual terms that allow a custodian, so the investor instructs a custodian, custodian 3, and that custodian doesn't have to cause the investor's name to be on the register. They can have their own name on the register or delegate to a sub-custodian who can delegate to another sub-custodian. So the problem there becomes one of multiple contracts, and those contracts erode the sort of the value of the investor's portfolio. And I'll give you an example of why that was. So this is 2008, Bear Stearns was restructured, and what was happening was there were a number of shareholders of Bear Stearns, and JP Morgan wanted to buy all those shares, and they established a price at which they were prepared to buy all of the shares in Bear Stearns. Now, when this then was processed, it was discovered that there were more people that thought they were shareholders. They had entries on their accounts that showed that they were shareholders in Bear Stearns, but they together held 28% more shares than the company had actually issued. So what happened then is JP Morgan said, we're not sorting this out. We'll recognize all of you. And that, of course, meant that they all took a reduction. So for every one of them, they shared the whole purchase price. But because there was more of them, they each got less. Something similar happened in the Dole Foods case. Again, there were more shareholders than shares had been issued. And this happened because it is very difficult to have records align completely. So it is possible, for example, that custodian one makes a mistake in allowing securities to be lent, and so there are fewer securities. So there are two people, then the investor believes they're a shareholder and the borrower believes they're a shareholder for the time being. So there's an operational problem that can occur in the record keeping. And the other problem is the case of Ekele, where Mr. Ekele didn't have a remedy to claim for the loss of value caused by a delisting. And the other example is Secure Capital, which is a case where the buyer of bonds was able to claim for an alleged mis-selling of those bonds to him. So here are the two examples. This is the Ekele case, and that's it's his custody chain, and this is Secure Capital's custody chain. So the trouble is, the effect of those chains is an erosion of the rights of investors. And here is a case which gives us a little bit of a silver lining. It has to do with compensation being paid under FISMA. That is for cases where FISMA applies. It's SL Claimants and Tesco. So it was held that the definition of an interest in securities applies to end investors. So it was an interpretation of the FISMA case. So the question is, so why is this? Why do investors accept this? So that's a very big question. And the answer to that is probably that the market doesn't get enough scrutiny. So investors pay perhaps attention to what kind of securities they buy. Already that's, a small, probably a small minority of investors. Most investors just buy funds. But then how those are held is an afterthought and is not a priority that investors look at. And another question is, then leading on from that, would distributed ledger technology provide a solution? And the answer is, it could technologically, but it doesn't, I don't think, from the perspective of business practice, because investors, as I said, don't pay very much attention to how securities are held. So that's sort of an area that doesn't receive scrutiny from the market participants. Yeah, so we then spoke again about distributed ledgers and digital assets, and asked that question of what could change, and as I said, it would be a method of allowing service providers to share records, and so in some ways make it unnecessary for, and not in some ways, let me go back to this. So what you could do is you could say, well, custodian 3 then no longer needs the central securities depository, custodian 1 and custodian 2. What they can do is they can share a ledger with everyone, and the investor can be directly entered. But for that to happen, we probably need push from investors, and investors aren't prepared to exercise that push. So it seems that they're accepting this, or rather, my view is there's not enough competition in the market to exercise pressure on custodians. Okay, that's it for the last topic.